I think one of the biggest takeaways from this project for me is that pollinators are really, really using log landings for both food and nesting resources. And that was in of itself kind of something that was really exciting because they're often thought of as pretty degraded parts of a forest landscape. But I think pollinators are, moving between the adjacent forest and the landing and really interacting with these openings.
From the University of Massachusetts Amherst Extension Service, this is PolliNation, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Nicole Bell, pollinator specialist and extension educator in the Center for Food, Agriculture, and the Environment. I'm so excited to sit down with Aliza Fassler today in this episode. Aliza is a PhD candidate in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her PhD research focuses on habitat restoration, management, and conservation for wild bees and some wasps, and on improving pollinator habitats as part of sustainable logging practices. And beyond our research, she serves as a co-chair of the UMass Bee Campus USA committee, which is a committee I'm also on, and have really enjoyed getting to know Aliza and all of the other committee members through that work. So she does a lot to improve pollinator habitats, not just on campus, but also learning again about forests through her research. So without further ado, I'm really excited to get into this conversation we have today on what log landings are and this idea that unconventional habitats can actually be really important places for wild bees and also non-bee pollinators like wasps. Hi, Aliza. Happy to have you here with me today.
Hi, Nicole. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited and honored to be here.
Great. So, in order to understand the importance of log landings, we have to understand what we know about many forests in the country today compared to many years ago. So, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the context for my research on log landings kind of falls within the context of the changes of forest across the eastern US more broadly since really European colonization. So prior to European colonization, we had a forested landscape that was a pretty diverse composition of like mature old growth forests that have canopy gaps in them because of the natural disturbances that happen in forests, like wind, like beavers, like diseases. And then we also had a mix of more open canopy forests, things like here in the Northeast, pitch pine scrub oak barrens, or oak barrens as you move into the Midwest, shortleaf pine forests. And those were forests that had a more greater spaces between the trees, which is what I mean when I say a more open canopy forest structure. And those forests were maintained by disturbance, most often fire, both from natural ignition sources, and the use of fire to steward forests by indigenous peoples. And so, broadly, over the last several hundred years, our forests in the eastern US have changed from this diverse mix of open and closed canopy, complex structures to a more simplified, more homogeneous, younger, less than 100 years old in general, closed canopy forests. And when we think about pollinators, those young closed canopy forests don't necessarily provide all of the resources that bees and wasps and other pollinators need, and they provide very different resources than the complex old growth forests and the more open canopy forest types.
Right, that makes sense. And so when we think about log landings, first of all, tell us what a log landing is, because I'm sure that's a new term for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it was a new term for me when I started my research, when I started my PhD. A log landing is basically the staging area for a timber harvest or a logging event. And so anytime managers are going in, whether to produce timber for human needs or to open up the canopy a little bit to support wildlife like pollinators and other creatures that need those gaps in the canopies and forests. They need a place to stack up logs before they send them off to mills for processing, and they need a place to operate the heavy equipment you use in timber harvesting. And so they make these areas along logging roads that are completely cleared of vegetation, and they become kind of an open canopy habitat within our often younger closed canopy forests here in the eastern US. They're really generally pretty small, usually around like half an acre in size. And that's because while the timber harvesting can make really good habitat for a lot of wildlife, the landings themselves tend to be pretty intensely impacted by heavy equipment moving back and forth. And so they end up being pretty barren and sometimes can look pretty rough after the end of a timber harvesting event. But they're small, so we can keep that impact on the forest small.
Okay, so you mentioned there's pros and cons to these sites. They have increased light exposure, but also soil compaction. So what are some of the other challenges associated with these types of sites when it comes to creating habitat?
Yeah, so they're open. So there's light reaching the forest floor, which means that you might see more herbaceous things coming back. But because of that soil compaction, revegetation can be really slow because levels of compaction can be so high that a plant's roots can't even get into the soil. They sometimes have big problems with invasive plant species because many invasive plant species, the reason they're invasive is that they are great at thriving in tough environments. And so some of the landings that I worked on for my research, we would have species like stiltgrass or Sericea lespedeza, and those could be, like shoulder high stands of invasive plants. And there can also be big problems with deep layers of mulch and slash because when timber harvesting is taking place, having that layer of mulch and slash on the ground actually helps protect the soil from the heavy equipment.
Hmm.
But once logging is over, it actually can keep, again, plants from getting into the soil, and it can also prevent, I believe, bees and wasps and other pollinators from nesting in the soil as well.
Right. So what are going back to the challenges, what are some of the mitigation methods, starting with, I guess we'll start with invasive plants and then we'll take it over to soil.
Yeah, for sure. So with the invasive plants, there definitely can be applications of herbicide, but what we were most interested in on my project, which is a big collaborative project with the US Forest Service called the Pollinator Habitat and Log Landings Project, we were most interested in seeing if seeding with native plant species would early after a landing is done being used, is closed out, could help sort of take over space in the landing and stop some of those invasive species from dominating. And then thinking about the soil side of things, generally the you kind of have to deal with that compaction piece in order to get the seeding to work
Right.
as well. And on that side of things, in our project, we tested two strategies to reduce soil compaction. The first is called subsoiling. So it's a form similar to tillage, and rather than mixing the soil horizons, which you commonly see in like agricultural tillage, it takes these two or more giant tines and you drag them through the soil on a skid steer. And what that does is it breaks up soil compaction and sort of shatters the soil, which lets water infiltrate and helps further break down compaction. And it's a sort of less disruptive form of tillage that we wanted to test out. And then the other method that we used was biochar. So that is organic material burned in an oxygen limited environment. There's a couple of ways you can do it. And you can use everything from, leftover logging material, leftover slash, yeah, there's all sorts of things people use to put into biochar. But it's a really interesting material because it's really fluffy. It kind of looks like a cross between like charcoal and sand. So it's like a dark
Hmm.
sand-like material. And when you add it to the soil, it makes the soil more porous. It draws in water and it helps hold on to nutrients. And so it's helping to break down the compaction by adding more pore space in the soil.
Interesting. So tell me what the timeline looks like going from when a log landing is no longer being used to the time until you're able to seed with native vegetation. What does the timeline look like? I'm sure it varies, but I'm curious.
Yeah, so we recommend seeding as quickly as you can because that's going to also help reduce your challenges with invasive plant species and help you get those competitive native species in there quickly, taking up space, taking up resources before the invasive plants can get in. So on our project, we used landings that were generally like 1 to 2 years active within the last year or 1 to 2 years post logging. We had a couple that were a bit older, about 5 years post logging, and we did end up having some more challenges with invasive plant species on those landings in particular. So, one thing we're recommending in our general technical report that came out of this project is that folks, if you can time it right, you clear off all that slash and mulch from a landing in the fall, and then you could do a fall or winter seeding. Most of our sites were seeded in March of 2021, and then I was out there by June sampling bees and seeing things starting to come up from the plants that we seeded.
Wow. Okay, so what did you learn from seeding? I know you probably seeded with many species of plants, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you tried seeding with and then some of the patterns you noticed or any of the characteristics of a successful log landing plant.
Yeah, so well, one thing I'll say is that log landings are really variable to start off with, and that depends on what kind of timber harvest, how much timber came through the landing, how, how much care the landing was treated with when it was in operation. So some landings actually have great plants in the seed banks, and seeding is really most beneficial when you're finding that stuff's not coming back so well
Hmm.
on its own. But to your question, we tried 27 forbs, so herbaceous flowering plants targeted for pollinators that were native across the full area of my study, which is all the way from Indiana down to Missouri. And those were chosen broadly by Forest Service botanists based on what they were seeing on older log landings along roads in the forest and species that they felt were really competitive. And then we also had 4 grasses in there as well to help out with soil stabilization, providing other support for wildlife. But what we found from that whole seed mix, that's 27 forbs and 4 grasses, can be kind of an intimidating seed mix, right? That's kind of a
Yeah,
lot. What we found is we had about like 6 to 8 species that really established well. And in some ways, I was sad to not see some of the plants come up, but in other ways, that's kind of good news because it means that you might be able to use a reduced seed mix that might be a little more cost effective of
right.
these really competitive species and still see benefits in terms of providing additional food for pollinators, nesting resources for pollinators, and pushing out some of those non-native plant species. And so, yeah, if folks are interested, we have like a general technical report through the Forest Service where people can see our full plant list. But some of the ones that I'll shout out here are in our first year, our most used plant species by bees in areas that we seeded was a species called Plains coreopsis. It
Mm.
does really well in tough places. And yeah, that was one of the plants we were most frequently catching bees off of because it was one of the only things that was blooming on a log landing in the first year.
Wow. Okay, tell me a little bit more about that plant. What is it? What does it look like? What's the growth habit?
Yeah, I mean it's pretty low growing. A it kind of came in early in our seed mix and then it kind of faded out over time and other plants came in after. It's yellow and orange. It's really a very attractive plant. It kind of looks like it has almost like it has a dark orange color, which I imagine if you looked at it in UV is a sort of a nectar guide like structure
Yeah.
on the center of the plant, helping bees find pollen and nectar resources. And I think we found that Plains coreopsis and black-eyed Susan alone, we recorded 34 different bee species just visiting those 2 plants that,
Wow.
again, were some of the ones that did really well in our first year. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we kind of just got into it, but I would love to
Yeah.
hear more about the diversity of bees we found. I know you also found some really interesting wasp species. So
Yeah.
whatever general overview you want to give, and then I'm sure we'll get into all the specifics.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think one of the biggest takeaways from this project for me is that pollinators are really, really using log landings for both food and nesting resources. And that was in of itself kind of something that was really exciting because they're often thought of as pretty degraded parts of a forest landscape. But I think pollinators are, moving between the adjacent forest and the landing and really interacting with these openings. So one of our biggest takeaways is we found about 3 times as many bees as we initially expected on the
Wow.
project. So I'm still working through IDing some of the specimens. But in our first year, so 2021, we found about 9,129 bees across all 3 national forests of 105 different bee species, which I was really excited by because, again, that's pretty incredible diversity from an area that's generally considered pretty poor quality habitat for just about anything.
Right.
And that included some species of conservation concern, like the American bumblebee, which I was delighted to see on log landings coming from Massachusetts, where it hasn't been seen, I believe, since 2012. In the lower Midwest, there are still some pretty healthy populations, and it was the first time I had seen one was on one of our treated log landings. And then, yeah, we proceeded to find them using log landings on all 3 national forests.
Wow. So you found over 100 bee species
Yeah,
and something I'm really personally interested in and my research background is all in
yeah,
functional traits. So I'm
yeah,
curious some of the diversity because sometimes we
yeah,
hear that, you find X number of species, but they're
sure.
all really functionally similar or they're
Yeah.
all, they're trend towards eusocial. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the trait diversity too that you saw in some of these bee species.
Yeah. So it's definitely something that I'm still working through analyzing, but I would say that we had a large number of social ground nesters, which is pretty common in areas that are recently human disturbed. So we did get a
Mhm.
lot of those Lasioglossum dialectus, many, many Lasioglossum dialectus species. But we also got species that again are more indicative of like intact forest areas and wet and really high quality wetlands. For example, we found a species called Lasioglossum hartii, which is of conservation concern in the lower Midwest, and it's associated with like really nice wetlands generally. And so there was a really nice wetland behind one of our landings, and then it was coming out to the landing using some of those floral resources. So one thing that really interests me as well is sort of like how the landings are interacting with the rest of the forest ecosystem. And we also found a lot of pollen specialists, largely of plants that we might consider weedy, but nonetheless are the really important herbaceous plants um,
Right.
in early successional areas in our forests. So yeah.
Wow, that's great news. So beyond the bees that you found too, I know one thing I've been recently really interested in is some of these often overlooked pollinator groups, and
Mm,
one of those is certainly wasps.
mm,
So I'm curious which types of wasps you were finding and what also that might tell us about the environment.
yeah. So I looked at bee communities using a couple of different sampling methods for this project. I used time standardized netting, so catching bees for a set amount of time in a set area using basically butterfly nets. I used bee bowls to help me get a broader picture of the community. And then I also used what are known as soil emergence traps. And this is something that everyone told me not to do, but I stubbornly did it anyways. And that's because a soil emergence trap is essentially like a tiny tent that you set up randomly at dawn or dusk in an area, hoping that underneath the tent you have caught a bee or a wasp's nest.
So do you have to look for nest entrances and then decide where to place your tent, or you just place your tent randomly?
So you can look for nest entrances. We decided to just place our tents randomly because with that method, what we were really interested in was trying to understand how the soil treatments that we use to reduce compaction might affect ground nesting beneficial pollinators.
Mm.
Because we really wanted to make sure, if we're dragging these, I think it's like, 2 foot tines through the soil and adding this material that really changes the pH and the nutrients in the soil, we really wanted to make sure that that wasn't potentially having negative impacts on our, the species we're trying to support, our ground nesting pollinators. And so that is the one method where I also sampled wasps, which is what I'm getting at. And so this was sort of essentially like a needle in a haystack hunt for bees and wasps' nests. But we ended up finding 35 nests on log landings, which to me was really exciting. That's a pretty good number of nests for this challenging method.
Right.
And it was of 20 different bee and wasp species. I believe I believe we found like 15 or so wasp species, and some of them are biocontrol agents in addition to being pollinators. And I was really excited to share that with our my collaborators in the Forest Service because, our forests are also dealing with a number of invasive insect pests
Right.
right now. Yeah. We found a species called the smoky winged beetle bandit or
Wow.
Ciceris. Yeah, great name.
That's a
Often I feel
great
like
name.
common names for bees and wasps are not that great. That one I feel like is an awesome one.
Yeah. What's the Latin name for that one?
Yeah, it's Ciceris fumipennis, and I may be butchering that pronunciation. So
It's
yeah,
easy to do.
um, but it's often used as a biosurveillance tool for emerald ash borer beetle.
Oh, interesting.
So it can help track areas where emerald ash borer beetle might be becoming established and killing ash trees, which is, another big factor influencing forests in the eastern U.S. right now.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so decent diversity. Well, way more diversity than you expected
Yes.
on the bee front. And then were wasps sort of an add-on that you were hoping to find, or did you have any expectation about what wasps or hypothesis about what wasp community you might find, or was it just
Yeah.
a pleasant surprise?
Yeah, I mean, the wasp diversity was a pleasant surprise to me. We also found a huge diversity of spider wasps, which I've really enjoyed learning about their varied life cycles because wasps are sort of a newer group of insects for me. And a lot of the spider wasps, we've had a really hard time getting to morpho species. So I was saying like 15-ish species, or excuse me, getting to species. So I was saying like 15-ish species, and part of that is because we've had a really hard time IDing all of our spider wasps to species level. They're really tough.
Yeah, tell everyone what a spider wasp is.
Yeah, so they're in the Pompilidae family, and they look kind of spidery in appearance. They're generally black with long, skinny legs. They use spiders as a source of food for their offspring. Most of them are true ground nest builders, so they excavate nests using structures on their legs and their mandibles, and then they put a spider into that nest, lay an egg on it, and their offspring will develop on that paralyzed spider. Yeah, it's been really interesting learning about them. It turns out, just like bees, there are some that are active at different times of the year. There's different prey for each different species in terms of what spiders they seem to use. And they're really, an important part of regulating spider populations in our ecosystems as well.
Wow, interesting. So I'm curious, I know you're still working through some of your data,
Yeah.
and what things are you still curious about? I suppose, what things do you still hope to answer with the information you've already gathered? And then beyond that, what are some questions that you would you would now have?
Yeah. So one of the sort of next steps that I'm really interested in is looking at not only the influence of local nesting and floral resources on log landings, but also the influence of where a landing was located within like a forest landscape on the bee community. Because one thing I'd like to be able to help provide information on is if you are a forest manager and you have 10 landings to choose from, but you have the budget to seed five, then the question might be, okay, which five should I prioritize if my goal is, for example, to maximize the diversity of the pollinator community that I'm supporting?
Right.
And so one of my next steps is going to be looking at the history of forest management in the areas around the landings, as well as the amount of forest cover, agricultural land cover, and how that in combination with the local resources affects which bees are there. So I can hopefully help a little bit with those kinds of decisions.
What could the metrics of success look like if you're a land manager and you're considering taking on a seeding project or any
Hmm.
type of rehabilitation for the purpose of pollinator habitat? What what metrics could you use to evaluate success and what does the timeline look for that?
Yeah, great questions. So I should say one of our goals with this project was to have this be pollinator habitat that could establish relatively rapidly. So my project spanned 3 years, and our goal was to see, what kind of pollinator habitat could we build in 3 years. So that's kind of the general timeline that we were thinking of with this project. And the idea is also that this habitat is ephemeral. It's early successional habitat. Log landings are frequently reused. And so um, like most early successional habitats in a forest, it's going to be ephemeral, and you might come in 20 years later and reseed the landing for pollinators. And within 3 years, hopefully, you have a relatively established planting that's supporting pollinators and helping deal with some of those other challenges. So that's one note on our sort of our timeline. The other part of your question, which is sort of metrics of success, is I sometimes feel like this could be a little bit annoying sometimes, but it's going to depend on your goals, right?
Right.
For our project, the metrics of success are seeing higher bee diversity on the landings that we treated compared to landings that we left as controls. That's one of our big metrics of success. And also seeing higher bee abundance in areas that we seeded compared to areas that we left unseeded. And from for someone who is a manager or a private landowner, doing the kind of really detailed surveys that we did is probably it would not be a great undertaking, right? That's not going to meet your goals, your
Right.
time, your funding. So, it can be something as simple as doing sort of a couple of follow-ups where you're doing like visual counts of what you're seeing for a set amount of time on a landing, or using some more simple visual survey methods to keep track of what kind of pollinators you're seeing before you treat a landing and after you treat a landing with, for example, seeding. It could also be if you're looking at what plants are there and seeing, if you see reductions in the invasive plant species are there, that might also be a metric of success for you, and increases in the richness of what plant species are there. But yeah, ultimately it'll depend on your goals. If you're really interested in species conservation concern, if you're seeing some of those bumblebees that we might be really concerned about showing up on your landings, that would be a great metric. And, learning how to ID those in of itself can be a challenge, but I think bumblebees can often be a more accessible species to start with.
Right.
Um, yeah, so frustratingly, my answer is it depends on your goals and it depends on your capacity and what you're really interested in.
That's what I always say is the answer for like almost any ecological
Yeah.
question is it depends.
Yeah.
I'm curious too, because I know when I picture a log landing in my head,
Yeah.
I picture it in a distant land, like
Yeah.
totally untouched by people. But what I
No.
learned in doing a little bit of background research is that sometimes people will camp on log landings or
Yeah.
they become recreational areas. So tell me a little bit more about what that can be like and areas of opportunity created from that, and then also concerns over, having people use these spaces as well. So how do you mitigate that?
Yeah. So often in the big national forests that I worked in, log landings weren't necessarily the places where we were most hoping to have people camp
Right.
because we're hoping to have those become early successional habitat and then also, revegetate. And sometimes we had challenges with people driving over some of our field sites,
Oh no.
which were unexpected challenges, right? But that's the reality of
Yeah.
field work. A lot of log landing sort of best management practices recommend putting, for example, like big logs sort of to block people from parking on those areas. If you were, for example, revegetating an area for pollinators, I think it would be really wonderful to add some signage. We did not do this for our project, but I think some of the forests that I work with are interested in doing this now because I think it could also be a really nice way to educate people, especially given that these are areas right along roads where they are often maybe stopping to pull over, maybe stopping to camp. So I think there could also be some really cool chances to educate people about log landing restoration for pollinators in some of these places.
Yeah, I think that's great. Admittedly, I've not explored many of many of our forests on the East Coast since I moved from Oregon, but I know in Oregon we have a really large managed conifer forest
Yeah.
industry.
Yeah.
And it's a mix between public lands and private lands as well. But I mean, growing up, we would use so many of these research forests for trail running or hiking, and
Totally.
I would see log landings without knowing what they were.
Totally.
And so I'm all about, of course, the idea of signage.
Yeah.
And I think there's the element too of knowing what a log landing is and pollinator habitat, but also all of your work on forest bees at all, and just forests
Yeah.
not being the primary habitat that people often think of when they picture where a bee might live. I
Absolutely.
know forests are usually not the first place that comes to mind for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's something that I love talking to people about, especially here in the eastern US because we're such a forested area. I think people often think like, "Ugh, I don't know what to do for pollinators. I live in a forest. It's really shady. My yard is really shady. What do I plant?" And so I love being able to share with people that like, actually, if you've got some forest on your property, you are already supporting pollinators.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think I get questions too from people that, they have, whether it's their home garden space or a site that they're working on, and they feel really limited by the fact that, there's not a potential to create a wildflower
Yeah.
meadow in full sun. So I think just even having the expansion of awareness of insects too are, I always say they're more resilient than we
Mm.
give them credit for. And
Hmm.
I think the nesting, especially in your study, kind of points to that these insects they'll find these spaces and
Hmm.
they're pretty adept at using them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about log landings is so where we're finding nests, we're finding them in areas of bare ground on log landings. And if you look into the literature in terms of like how bees and wasps choose where they nest, it's really species specific. There's some papers that suggest that there's negative associations with soil compaction. But there's others that suggest if you have for example, a group of bees that are nesting in an aggregation, so you have many nests together, that they might actually benefit from a little bit of soil compaction because it keeps your nest from caving in your neighbor's nest.
Interesting. I've
Uh,
never heard that before.
Nobody has demonstrated this experimentally, but that's sort of been some of the things that have been, guessed at in papers looking at the relationships between bees and wasps and compaction. So, while I think overall reducing the soil compaction on these landings is ultimately benefiting bees and wasps by providing them with more food, helping that become a more diverse early successional habitat, I also think some of that soil disturbance may actually be why we're seeing so many bees and
Interesting.
wasps there in the first place. And there's also been, anecdotal species-specific reports of bees and wasps nesting in areas where the soil is disturbed and where the soil is really compacted.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so some key takeaways, I've
Yeah,
gotten from this is that there's more bees using log landings than we thought, which
100%.
is a great sign. And there's a select number of native plants that also tend to do well as these sort of early
Hmm.
successional plants to come in, which
Hmm.
I like what you said about. In some ways, that's a good thing because it makes the application of seeding a little bit less intimidating, maybe, and
Right.
and more accessible. So, my last question for you is, from what you've learned about the bee community so far, what might that tell us about the contribution of log landings as a whole in these woodland systems, if anything?
Yeah. I mean, so I think the log landings are interesting in that they're functioning both as places where bees are getting food from early successional plants. They're functioning as places where bees and wasps and other pollinators are nesting. And so I think many of these bees and wasps are living in the landings, and many of them are also coming in from the surrounding forest. And I think at different parts of their life cycle, bees and wasps and other forest pollinators often use resources from different habitats within a forest, from the more open habitats and the more closed canopy habitats. So you might have a species that's nesting under some deep leaf litter in the adjacent, more closed canopy forest that's coming into a log landing to eat, essentially, right?
Mhm.
And you might have the opposite. You might have, especially like a cavity nester in a snag in the forest where the timber came from, and then is coming seasonally to a log landing when there's an abundance of floral resources there. But that forested habitat is providing it with other food at other, earlier in the season for other species. So I think my takeaway is that they're sort of part of this diversity of habitats within a forest that support pollinators. And I think it's just really important that we think about them as these habitat spaces and think about ways in which we can keep enhancing them for wildlife rather than just being like, these areas they're pretty crummy looking. Let's let's just leave that. Right.
Right. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Aliza, for sitting down with me today. And I know everyone listening is going to be just as fascinated as me hearing about your work.
Yeah, thanks so much again for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links are available at our YouTube channel, PolliNation Podcast. You can also submit feedback on our website. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on Apple Music, Spotify, or whatever platform you use. Finally, if you'd like to learn more about our work to promote pollinator education and outreach across Massachusetts and New England, or register for our Pollinator Steward Certification Program, visit our website at ag.umass.edu/pollinators.